if you follow the timeline, if you follow the sources, you come to the conclusion that the main organization that was responsible for Cold War anti-communist propaganda in the whole of Greece was actually founded in a science and religion Christian journal and association.
For many of us, the terms East and West, science and religion, carry meanings that we associate with specific things in the world. By this I mean they point to something we intuitively understand out there. But any comparative analysis of these terms, whether across cultures, across time, across religions, or across sciences, reveals a complex story that is interwoven with histories, ideologies, languages, cultures, and more. These complexities are not only important for those whose job is to produce scholarship on such topics, but is also critical to know more generally, to understanding the complexity behind such seemingly well-known terms that are so central to our experiences and orientations in the world, and the part they play in organizing us with respect to our place in the world. For us here in the West, any confrontation with the East usually conjures images of, say, China, Korea, Japan, or India. But this is complicated by the idea of a Orthodox Christianity that is often referred to as Eastern Orthodoxy. Greece is an interesting exemplar of this. Not only is it considered by many the birthplace of Western culture, but it is also part of the European Union. It is also a place that many Europeans and North Americans view with a type of historical longing. And yet, as we'll hear today, Greece is a peculiar place with a rather complex historical entanglement between science and religion, history and culture, ideology and politics. Its place in history has long been central to the very notion of the West, yet its historical identity challenges any such claim. My guest today is Kostas Tampakis, a senior researcher at the Institute of Historical Studies of the National Hellenic Research Foundation. His research has focused on the history of relations between science and Orthodox Christianity, the history of science and technology in the Greek-speaking world from the 18th to the 20th century, and the history of science education more generally. As always, I am Anthony K Nairn, Assistant Director of the International Society for Science and Religion, and welcome back to the ISSR YouTube channel and ISSR In Conversation series. If you have any questions or comments, please do so below, hit the like button, and consider subscribing for more scholarly content on science and religion. Please enjoy this episode. Welcome, Kostas. Thank you for joining us on the ISSR In Conversation podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's my honor.
So, we've met a couple times, which was really great, but I just want to go back to the first time that I met you, if that's okay, because I think it sets the stage for this conversation and where I think it's likely going to go. So I had the honor of being accepted to go to a summer school on science, religion, and orthodoxy, or the East, if we will, on Crete Island in Greece, which was my first time there. Fantastic. And I was struck by the conversations that were happening, not only because they were so removed from my educational experience, but the emphasis on much of the lectures given during that time were on the political drivers behind the interactions between science and religion. And this was really amazing to me because in the history and philosophy of Western science and religion, the political is there, but its emphasis is much less than what I found in my time at the summer school. And in preparation for this discussion, I read your chapter and your introduction and skimmed over the book that you and the late Ron Numbers edited, as well as an article that kind of is a spiritual successor to your chapter, and it just reminded me of that deep interconnection between science, religion, politics, ideology, and this kind of back and forth that flows between them, and it really just kind of reminded me of how great and how much I took away from that time. So I wanted to start with that little thank you. But before I do get into this conversation with you and expand upon some of those things that I just mentioned, I would like to simply ask, where are you currently? Where are you coming to this conversation? And then after that, if you want to provide some background about where you are coming from academically and maybe what the thread was that brought you from graduate education into the science and religion field as a professional scholar.
First of all, thank you for taking the time to introduce how we met. It was very important that you could come back then in Crete, and I have had the pleasure of discussing with you these matters in years after that. So I started as a physicist, an honest to God physicist who wanted to teach physics with a diploma in physics from the University of Athens. And I did my graduate studies not in history or philosophy or theology, but actually in science education. And I pursued a PhD in the history of science education. And this is how slowly and gradually I became a historian of science. I've had the pleasure of working with Thimios Nikolaidis when he was the director of research in the program of the history of science in the National Hellenic Research Foundation, which is where I'm currently based. I'm a researcher there. And while I was doing my PhD with another Greek scholar in the primary department, primary education department, of the University of Athens, Kostas Kordoulis, politics were very much on our minds. We're very politically oriented as a program and as a master's program. And I had the great fortune of working with Thimios Nikolaidis when he started working and more or less initiated the field of the history of science and the field of the history of the relations of the natural sciences with Orthodox Christianity. He was a pioneer in this field, and he wrote the only, back then, book on the subject. So I had the great fortune of being able to see a field being created in front of my eyes. We were awarded a Templeton Foundation grant for 3 years. Exactly, it was called So Science and Orthodox All Over the World, which had as its main goal to bring together all the relevant scholarship and push it forward. And this is how I came to work, perhaps not exclusively, but mainly on the intersection between the history of science of the natural sciences, Orthodox Christianity, and what we could perhaps call ideology. And I'll stop here because how this interrelates is perhaps another part of our discussion.
Yeah, okay. So you're actually coming from this with a background in the sciences, in physics, which is interesting. And at what point did your physics education turn into your interest in science communication, science education, and then the history of science? Like what was that transition or the catalyst of it?
My interest in science education began even in my undergraduate years. I had as my
Okay.
focus in my studies science education. So very early on, I had decided that I want to become someone who teaches physics. And this is why I pursued science education as a master's. And I've taught physics for almost 20 years. In the graduate studies I pursued in the primary education department, the focus was very much historical and philosophical. So I
Oh,
came
okay.
into actual contact with history of science and philosophy of science during my graduate years. And it became a very strong component of my formation as a science educator. We were doing a lot of work on how we could use history of science in science education. That was a million years ago, around 2002 and 2003.
About a
And
million.
about a million, give or take. Um, it feels like that right now. And this is how I came to, how I met Thimios Nikolaidis, who was a historian of science, still is. He's retired
Okay.
now, he's emerita. Um, and this is how my journey into history of science began through the history of science education.
Interesting. Okay. Wow. Okay. Interesting. So at what point during this transition into the history of science and did did science and religion and maybe even politics start entering your thought process? Was it through what you were seeing in the education of physics? For example, I know that Thomas Atchner at Queensland, University of Queensland, he wrote a book on the media and evolution and talked about the way that biological textbooks on biology kind of influence the way in which coming into be biologists see the conflict between science and religion as a conflict. Did you notice things like that, or like how did you get into science and religion from that?
This is a very interesting question and a very central one. Because when you are doing some kind of history of education, not so much history of science, but when you do history of education, the political aspect, it's always there. You cannot do history of education in the last 70 years without considering the political and ideological and cultural elements of the area you are studying. Education is always
Sure.
politically charged. So
Yeah,
more
sure.
or less, I was brought into history in general, in historical research, with the tacit and not so tacit consideration that politics is always important. And when you are doing any kind of history, more or less, within an area like modern Greece, and I always add modern Greece because when I say Greece and someone is not from around here, usually their mind goes to Aristotle and Plato and
Sure.
those people.
Sure.
And
Yeah, sure.
probably right now Odyssey and Iliad because they are very, they are everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, but I would also say when you are doing general historical research in Spain or France, you are always very mindful of the importance of, let's say, nationalism and national identity or religion, not as a theological consideration, but as an actual political and social reality. Because, for example, in Greece, the Orthodox Church is very powerful, socially, culturally, and politically. You cannot ignore it, and you shouldn't because it's a very important historical factor. So I more or less was formed into a historian with the consideration that this cannot go away. And coming from a leftist background, Marxist in the, let's say, uh, my grandfathers, my intellectual grandfathers were Marxists, let's say that, not the people who trained me, but the people who trained them. We were always mindful of these factors. And then I did history of science, um, which was in the, let's call it in the, let's say that field does not exist anymore. the reception studies. How did quantum theory arrive in so and so, in my case, Greece? How the theory of relativity emerged within Greece. And
Okay.
this is how I came to history of science.
Right. So basically, how what you're outlining is how a kind of like macro scientific theory comes into play within a specific culture, geopolitical and cultural context. So you
Yes.
mentioned quantum there. Okay, I understand. It really reminds me of a line. I'm going to butcher it. I'm sorry, but it was so eloquent. I have to say, but even before we even get to the book, that the introduction that you wrote to the book, which I guess I should ask because it was on my mind. Did you write that after after Ronald's passing? Yeah, okay. Okay. I have to say that the style of it was excellent. It was very quippy, which reminded me of you a lot, which I really enjoyed. But you had this one line right at the beginning, or very close to the beginning, and I'm just trying to find it because I wrote it down, and I'm having a hard time searching through my notes fast enough. But it was something. It was along the lines that um, the Eastern Orthodox is not so much about the religion, but the lived experience, the cultural, the political, and the people. And I thought that that was really powerful because it really emphasized, I think, not only my view of your work, and it helped kind of clear out what, or it helped notify me of what I should be looking at. But it helped put in juxtaposition the West, which has Christianity attached to it, but maybe not in such a bridged way that the East and the Orthodoxy, as you outline in that claim, was. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, about how, like, for example, I mentioned quantum physics coming into Greece. Like, how does that play out in the political, the cultural, and the religious dimensions? And what does that mean for the East and the Eastern Orthodox?
Um, you are bringing to the discussion a very important theme in many of the things I have done and Themios has done, and the team who more or less is behind all this process has done, which is what happens to the notions and the concepts that most of Western historiography takes for granted when we do not apply them to the West. And the concept of the West itself is one of these concepts. So the main question here, and it's something that has started at last to surface even in Western historiography, and I'm talking about books like Reading Darwin in Arabic by Marco El-Sakri, or Dealing with Darwin, which are excellent books. And the question here is, what did the people who read these theories, or who read Darwinism, or Darwin, what did they want to do with it? And history of science, and I think history of science religion, has discovered in the last 30 or 40 years that the main question these people had and their main consideration were not actual intellectual technical problems. They were questions about how would that affect them in their own work, which was socially and culturally embedded. So when, for example, quantum theory came to Greece, it had to do with materialism. It had to do with communism and anti-communism. It had to do with a long tradition of criticizing materialism in the Balkans and within the nascent Greek state, because modern Greece was founded more or less in 1828. And the fear that this kind of materialism would erode the basic national values, who were language, national descent from the ancient Greeks, and Orthodox Christianity. So This is a very different consideration from the ones we usually come across when we discuss the history of quantum theories, which is usually who read what. And of course, it brings us to the question of language, which Marshall Zucker's book did in an excellent fashion. These people did not, for example, read Darwin in English. No one read English in the 19th century, unless they were British themselves, Americans, or Indians. I mean, in India.
Yeah.
Everyone read French or German, and this is an important consideration because people back then did not translate. They more or less rewrote the theories that they sort of presented in their own language.
Right. Yeah. And you make it very, very plain at one point that there was a gentleman, I forget the name, I apologize, but that he did in fact read and write in English. You emphasized that, and like it was like that was really important to note. I forget who. I apologize. There's so many names that.
It's okay. You're probably talking about one of the Greek astronomers, like Kotsakis.
Yeah, yeah, and then he did in fact, and you emphasize that, and that was an important part. But what this also really kind of reminds me of how you open the introduction to the book, which is with a quote from Gregory V, where he's outlining these materialist values that are going to degrade and take away from the Greek people. And I thought this was really great because not only did it really set the tone for the introduction and the book, but it goes to show the importance of the political history of Greece, and probably the wider area more generally, but for Greece. And it was important for me being at the Greek summer school to learn about the history, especially in modern Greece, about something I didn't know about at all, which was the Greek Civil War. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that's like 36, 37 until the 70s, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It started officially around the end of the Second World War, so 46,
Oh,
and it
46,
went
46, apologies.
and it ended officially around 49, but its ramifications were felt for decades later.
For decades later, right? Okay. And this is a this is a really interesting point because you emphasize that Greece is like the only place where it's Orthodox, Western, and communist, or mostly communist at least. Maybe not officially communist, but has a strong communist root. And so, can you detail for those who are unaware of the history of modern Greece, like the importance of these elements, and then after that tie them into science and religion as you so eloquently do in your work? Like, can you bring that together for us?
Um, First of all, you are very generous in asking those questions because all us historians sort of think that our work is very important and everyone should know the context of what we write. So I should frown and say, but everyone should know the history of modern Greece. No, most people don't. Most Greeks don't. So it's okay. And I think a more general question can be put forward if we discuss these things. So Greece is founded, it emerges as the first state in the age of revolutions, if we remember the Hobsbawm books, in 1828, 1830. Belgium follows by something like 2 or 3 months, and they actually steal the first king who was initially was to come to Greece. King Leopold of Belgium, the first, was to become the first Greek king, and he does not. He goes to Belgium. Good for him because the actual first king, King Otto, got deposed later on. But the important thing here is that we have a new state who creates a national identity based on language, religion, and descent from ancient Greeks. And the main ideology, the main formative element here is nationalism. And one of the things I keep trying to put forward within history of science was that in the 19th century, everyone was a nationalist. And we keep writing history of science like these things did not matter. They mattered to everyone. And later on, you have a very strong communist element. During the first decades of the 20th century, communism comes to Greece. And communism presents itself as a scientific world theory, as the rational world theory, which means that the defenders of the conservative scholars within Greece had to more or less double down on this and prove that communism was not actually scientific, was not actually rational, it was also immoral, it had everything bad under the sun, which immediately more or less brings both science and religion into the discussion. So in Greece, we have a state who ends up being in the western part of the Iron Curtain, who is Orthodox, and being an Orthodox in Greece is part of your national identity. Still is. You are going to baptize your children even if you are an atheist, because this is what people do around here. I speak from experience. And we have a civil war where the communists fight Nazi occupation. They are at the forefront of Nazi occupation. And more or less, when World War II subsides, the British army more or less bombs the communists within Athens in order to regain control of the state, because it's under the British influence. And when the British Empire starts off more or less to fray at the end, Greece gets passed over to the Americans. So here we have a context where the Greek national identity really has to be defended against communism, which has a very strong political presence, but in a state where very specifically it has been allocated to the British and the American sphere of influence. And I think this confluence of factors is more or less unique in Europe. There are other states that have a very strong communist tradition, like France, like Italy, like Spain, but they are not Orthodox. And we have states that are very Orthodox, but do not end up in the western part of the Iron Curtain. One of the Greek historians puts it very nicely, where he says that for most historians, the velvet blankets of Orthodoxy got replaced with the Iron Curtain.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Because
Kitromilidis says that.
Yeah, the iron because the Iron Curtain was not only an economic split and a cultural split, but aside from Greece, it really was a religious split too, in some really interesting ways. And yeah, so Greece is really an outlier here, which is really interesting. And this kind of reminds me of an important fact that I think is often lost in a lot of general discussions about communism, and that is that communism is itself in the Marx and Engels um, kind of core of their work, not the kind of modernist takes on it, but at its kind of foundation level, it is materialist. But that presents a problem, right? Because science itself is often viewed as materialist. Um, and I think and again that quote at the very beginning of your introduction is doing a lot of really heavy lifting there. It's just so apt. It's like it was like it was written and it was destined to be used as like such a perfect quote for the book. But yeah, so and this tension between communism, materialism, science, and orthodoxy becomes kind of a core part of your chapter in that book, and the article that you sent me that kind of continues on that conversation, just in a more specific and slightly later period. So can you detail for us the kind of general moves that you make in those two things before we go into a little bit more depth about the kind of
Sure, sure.
more metaphysical aspects of those differences and those connections?
There is a meta-narrative here which sort of continues the line of argument I just pursued in your previous question, which is why would that be of interest to someone who is not a Greek historian? And this
Yeah.
will allow me to sort of to continue answering your question. And the thing is that, for example, there is a lot of work being done around Cold War history of science and Cold War history of science and religion. I mean, Freedom's Laboratory and a lot of books. I don't know how many, even of my peers, know that the Cold War actually started in Greece. I mean, in Greece and Turkey. The first Truman speech saying that we are going to defend the free people was about Greece and Turkey, so that they are not going to fall
Oh,
on communist hands. The Marshall Plan was created, was founded on Truman's speech about Greece and Turkey, for example.
interesting.
And this brings me to another part of your question. Why would anyone care if he's not, for example, a specialist in this issue? Working from Greece and on Greece and about Greece or on Spain, Jaume Navarro, my longtime colleague, also does that and collaborator, sort of pushes you, forces you to recognize these elements when usually in other kinds of more hegemonic historiographical spaces like Great Britain or the US, they get lost. For example, Great Britain did not have a civil war in the 19th century and 20th century. And it's an outlier historiographically. Most other people had, most other spaces had. So, to bring me back to your question, what is happening here? My argument is that this neat dichotomy between communism and non-communism geographically, science as anti-religious or something that can be harmoniously interwoven with religion, has usually been pursued intellectually. Like people were talking about theories and that's about it, and then they went to the club and had drinks. This is not the case in Greece. It
Mm.
was the intellectual background and context and ammunition in a civil war where brothers killed brothers literally, where people were being exiled, people were being killed, they were being pursued around their villages. For example, my grandfather was one of them. And many people's grandfathers in Greece and grandmothers were this kind of people. So this is not some kind of ancient history, it's a very lived experience. And it
Yeah.
was important because Orthodox Christianity was a lived experience. It was how people structured their lives around their church, around their parish. So for the Communist Party to sort of more or less say, you know, our ideology does away with all this. It's not scientific. It sort of created a backlash from scientists, let's call them perhaps scholars, Greek scholars in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, who said, no, you're actually mistaken. Orthodox Christianity is fully compatible with correct science. And this very early on gets recognized by both communists and anti-communists as an important intellectual field of battle. The secretary of the Greek Communist State, who would ironically die in exile in USSR later on because he backed the wrong faction within his own party, makes a speech right at the moment where the Greek Civil War starts saying these people are doing real damage to our cause, these scholars with their manifestos and their declarations saying that, you know, Greek Orthodoxy, Orthodox Christianity is fully compatible with science. And if you follow the timeline, if you follow the sources, you come to the conclusion that the main organization that was responsible for Cold War anti-communist propaganda in the whole of Greece was actually founded in a science and religion Christian journal and association. So a science and religion journal and corresponding association was at the forefront of Cold War anti-communist propaganda. I don't think you can get more political than that.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
was understood as something political by the people involved.
One thing that comes to mind when you're talking about this and reading and with the background of your writing in my mind is you outline very clearly how these anti-communist groups use use not only science, but you brought in an you make the claim that that their publication uses all of the academic fields. Like it's not just science, it's the legitimization of knowledge production to emphasize how they are all kind of coordinated on anti-communist ideals. And the thing that came to my mind when reading this was the legitimization, not the legitimization, sorry, but the legitimacy of science. It becomes very contested when you have different sides making different claims about science. And we often have, in at least in public and popular discussions, that science is more neutral. And maybe at some kind of idealistic level, it is in some sense, but in practice, it usually is not. And we see that very clearly here. So this is probably not so much about the history of science, but maybe more about a temperature reading of Greece itself. Can you tell us, for those not in Greece, what has this usage of science for various purposes, political and ideological purposes, has it had an impact on the legitimacy of science as a knowledge producing enterprise?
Once more, you are very spot on with your questions, and it allows me to bring back an element, a consideration of mine, which I have already mentioned once or twice, and it is the importance of language and how as a meta component of our work. Because here we are speaking in English, and in English the term science is very specific. If I go to an a native English speaker and say, tell me 2-3 scientific fields, he will say biology, chemistry, physics, geology. He will not say law or economics. But that's the English and perhaps a bit the French conception of science. In Greece and in many other places like Greece, for example in Germany, we have Wissenschaft, which is more or less any academic discipline. The Greek word is episteme, which has sort of been repurposed in the English language as epistemology, true knowledge.
Yes.
So in Greece, for someone to be epistemonas, which we usually translate as scientist, but he's not, he's someone who has done Wissenschaft. In Greece, we say, I studied to be an epistemonas, and we mean I studied law, I studied economics, I studied psychology, I studied in the university.
Interesting.
It's the old scientia, the medieval scientia, who's actually a translation of the Greek word episteme and so on and so forth. So, this brings me back to who had the expertise, the legitimacy to speak about episteme, not science, episteme, Wissenschaft in Greece. So you see economists or psychologists or medical doctors discussing about what in English we would call science, and no one bats an eye. No one says, why are you stepping out of your field? Or astronomers discussing psychology, because they are part of episteme, Wissenschaft.
Yeah.
This is a consideration that sometimes get lost when we stay within the English-speaking historical corpus. This was not a legitimacy problem for them. Everyone understood and agreed that everyone can speak about these things if he has gone to the university. And perhaps you remember it, perhaps you even know better than me, that the German university, the German model of the university with the 4 schools and so on and so forth, sort of creates this interrelation. So here, when we talk about the legitimacy of science, we are more or less talking about a specific field within the broader field of academically oriented knowledge.
Yes.
Of which sciences are but a part. And, as you very aptly put, the idea that science is something neutral is very, very recent, even as a normative conception. In the 19th century, no one thought that science, the English-speaking concept of science, was morally neutral. Darwin did not think so. Faraday did not think so.
Yes.
Newton did not think so. Voltaire did not think so.
Certainly not, yeah.
Lord Siemens of the eponymous corporation, one of the greatest of physicists and technologists, the word did not exist back then, but industrialists of the era, persuaded the newly created German state to have the first physics institution, research institution in the world, saying that this is our national duty. If Germany is to remain as at the forefront of progress, it has to have this kind of institution. This is a nationalist argument. This is a moral argument. This is an ideological argument.
Yeah.
And it created the first physics research institution in the world in the 19th century. So my argument is scientific practice was never considered neutral up until the beginning of the 20th century, even as a normative conception of the work that people were doing.
Yeah, that's an absolutely fair claim to make, and I guess I could push on that further. Then in Greece, then is the legitimacy of the university itself under attack in similar ways that we see happening in America as a result of this contested history?
That's a very interesting question. And it has to do with, for example, in order to be able to answer grounded on Greek history, one has to remember that the University of Athens was the first university in this part of the world. The first university in the Balkans. And one could say in the Ottoman Empire. Of course, it comes back to how we define the university. But university in the strict Western sense, the first one to appear in the general area is the University of Athens. And the first thing people say is, why do we need this? What are you going to do for us? So you see all the university professors, who were not that many, it was a small university, struggling to say that we are important for the national cause, not for science, for the national cause. So history is important because it shows how we go back to the ancient Greeks, and there is a whole Falmerayer discussion here, and if Greeks are actually descended from the ancient Greeks or the Slavs, and this is a 19th century firestorm that's happening in Greece. Law is important because we have a state to build. Medicine is important because people get sick. Why is philosophy, and science belongs to the philosophical school, is important? And here you see, why is theology important, which was another school? And you see the first actual academic experts saying we are important for the national cause. We are important not because of progress, we are important because we are Greeks. It's important to know science because we are Greeks. Again, the nationalism discourse. It's important to the national cause. This is how a university was legitimized in Greece. I'm not an expert. I have not actually worked on the history of universities in the US. I have worked a bit in a comparative study. But my understanding is that universities had a different trajectory within the US. And one can argue that universities existed before the US, in the US. Many of them were founded before the Declaration of Independence. So they had a different cultural context and background and legitimacy. And I think very aptly, I agree with what you very aptly said, it is a legitimacy crisis. Who has the right to speak about what? And I think it is one that universities in the US were not equipped to handle because they were not, they don't have a tradition of being challenged as important institutions. I don't think Harvard or Yale has ever had to defend itself as an important institution, as a valuable institution, and now they do, and they're unaccustomed to it.
Yeah, that's an interesting claim. Wow.
Where Greek universities or Spanish universities or French universities had to do so repeatedly.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so like the kind of conflict and struggle for existence, if we want to use Darwinian terms, really actually helps solidify the institution as necessary for the national character of a country or state. But this raises another question that you emphasize in your writing, and that is the deep history of Greece. So nationalism can be expressed in the immediate sense, but it does have a historical character. And as most of us know, Greece is in some views the birthplace of the West, even though that, you know, that I remember being at the summer school, and one of the fellow students there had a very interesting claim about that, kind of contesting that itself. But much of the West's architecture, like important architecture, its kind of claims to legitimacy, even some of the far right, even the far right interests look to like Rome and ancient Greece as like a model for how the world ought to be now. So like there's a lot of callbacks there. But for Greeks, they live in a world, especially I remember being in Athens and seeing the Acropolis just kind of hovering above the city at all times. And like, you know, that's a physical reality of a history stretching back 2,000 plus years, right? So how does that deep time, in terms of human deep time, how does that play into that discussion of orthodoxy and of science and of culture? Because like one thing that came to my mind as you said about the millennia trajectory that Greece has experienced is that, well, there was a time when the many cultures that constituted what we call Greece believed in a very different set of deities, right? And we love talking about them. We love creating media about them. We love all that, like Percy Jackson and so on and so forth. And even the new movie, by Christopher Nolan, plays with some of those elements, like Athena's in that, etc. So, like, these forces must shape the reality of Greece. And they must shape, to some extent, the reality of science, of religion, of culture, of ideology. So can you speak a little bit to that?
It comes back to how people in various places answer the question when they have to of who are we and who we are not. Historically speaking, the Greeks had to answer this question when they created the modern Greek state in 1830, or it was created for them, because it really more or less the French, the British and the Russian more or less stepped in the conflict with the Ottoman Empire, said now this is a state, and the Ottomans said how come, and the answer was because we said so. And
Sure.
this is how Greece was created, more or less. And we
Classic.
actually, for much of the 19th century, these were known as the guardian powers of Greece. Russia, France, and Great Britain. This is why our king
Interesting.
had to be from somewhere else, and he came from Bavaria.
Okay,
So,
interesting.
the answer to that question, because they had to define who could be a citizen of this new state, uh, took them through many turns. And what is interesting, what you said, because more or less now we say, but of course Greece is Western. It was not back then. When Greece was founded, its second king said, I'm going to make you the model kingdom of the East. Greece was to become the model kingdom of the East. Greece, for the
Interesting.
British Empire, was part of the Eastern question. It was part of the, I don't remember the exact name, but it had something to Middle Asia and Asia Minor Bureau of the Foreign Office. So for most of
Okay.
the 19th century, for most of Europe, and for the Greeks themselves, they were part of the East, the model
Interesting.
kingdom of the East. And there were a whole slew of discussion on what role are we going to play with this. We are going to bring back the light of civilization to the East. And this is, I think, something that scholarship on science and religion from Greece can be of interest to people outside Greece. As, for example, something you've alluded already, because you are very astute that way, on the whole discussion of what is Orthodox Christianity. How is it is defined, even in specialist books. So there isn't usually a chapter in Orthodox Christianity. There is a chapter on Eastern Christianity. And they more or less put together churches that are not in communion with each other. It's like someone creates, if someone would create a book on the history of Christianity and it would lump together Catholics and Protestants because they are in the West and discuss them in one chapter. Eastern
Yeah.
Christianity is not a term. There is no Eastern Christian religion. There is, but that has nothing to do with Orthodox Christianity. Orthodox Christianity is something else. And it's supposed to be a global religion. It has nothing to do with the East. And once more,
Do you think that?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
Sorry. Go. No. Go ahead, please. Please go ahead.
Once more, this is a recurring theme of what I'm trying to do. How this kind of scholarship forces us to confront the analytical categories within our field that we so take for granted, like West, like East, like Europe, like science.
Yeah. That was kind of my next question. What do you think that this discussion of the Orthodox of the East does for the West? Have you seen a change over the course of your tenure as an academic from Greece who has contact with the West? I mean, I've met you a number of times at various conferences in the UK. You were just in Edinburgh for HSS. Like what have you seen a change? You kind of hint at that there is a little bit of change happening in your introduction to your book, but what are you seeing?
It's an uphill struggle. Uh,
Sure.
and it's an uphill struggle in many ways. Believe that many of my colleagues now know that there is this thing called Eastern Christianity that should be taken, I wouldn't say seriously, but it should be considered, even if they do not want to do it. I found also very interesting how, I mean, this happened in very recent years. I mean, the last 2 decades or so, there was this explosion of global history, which was very important, and it taught us so many things. But what I find especially intriguing is that global history is about India, China, Japan, or the global south, which is Latin America. What is not there is Africa, the Balkans, we sort of get lumped together with Europe, and suddenly this historiographical hegemony of Europe suddenly includes us, which is a great surprise for us. So, this stepping away from Europe, we have to go to India or China. We don't have to go to Poland or Malta or Cyprus or Greece or Finland for that reason. Suddenly, we have to go over there. And it just so happens that these were the areas where the British Empire was very, very active. Or we are going to discuss the global south. South of what? The answer is the US.
Sure.
So, and my argument, the argument of Jaume Navarre alongside was that before we go macro global, we can perhaps go meso global and discuss Turkey, Greece, Poland, Serbia. These are modern names, but I think you understand my meaning. And how this became part of Europe. Because in many cases, for example, in the Nordic countries, that took a crusade. There were actually crusades trying to make these people Christians. But suddenly we are all Europeans. We have to discuss this notion. And I think there is a push towards us. There was this excellent book came out from Princeton University Press called West, the History of an Idea by Varouxakis, who discusses more or less that. And there were others before him. I think this is a direction that has not been explored sufficiently within the field of science and religion. How our field can help imagine the concepts of global history, the global south, east, west, Europe, not use them so that we can have nice grand applications about religion and the global south, question them.
Yeah, it's as if that in the push for understanding the world, we forget that parts of the world are actually hidden behind the veneer of sameness, even when it's so different. And you know, that same individual that questioned my my poke that Greece has a lot of the kind of like source of the West was also very adamant that Greece not be thought of as European in any sense outside of the economic engines that and policy decisions that bind them together, but that culturally, linguistically, historically, it is very much not European. To which I quipped, well, your plugs are the same. but
That's actually a good argument.
Yeah. but that I think that's really important to remember, is that there can be a place that is European on paper, but it's just so different on every other measure that we consider human endeavors on.
And I think this is I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please.
I think this is an argument that can be made for many areas. It can be made for Spain. It can be made for Italy. It can be made for Finland. I've mentioned already Finland once. Or Sweden. Europe is actually not very European if you really look at it. Or Austria. Or Ukraine is a borderline case, but we can discuss it if we want. Or all these areas. And I think that the same argument can be made, for example, for the USA. I'm not sure how this idea of Americanness applies both to Nebraska, Michigan, Texas, or New York. I think we are now at the position that we can start using finer brushes and combs in our scholarship than these blanket statements of European hegemony. Who's Europe? Who's a hegemony? Usually, they are the very famous three states: the UK, France, and Germany.
Yeah, the economic powerhouses, in a lot of ways, have and always will determine who is who is has the primacy of the conversation. Yeah, absolutely. Um, I want to just give you an opportunity because we're kind of closing in here on an hour, which is crazy. It went by so fast. But I'd like you to um, tell us a little bit more about how your work, because you mentioned that you mentioned the complexity principle
Mhm.
at the beginning, which of course more or less is formulated by John Headley Brooke, but is
Mhm.
identified by Ronald Numbers, who helped
Mhm.
you, who was your co-editor on your
Mhm.
book. And I'm just wondering if you see the work that you did in that collection of really fantastic essays. I have to say, like I'm
Thank you.
so looking forward to reading the rest of them. I got to Sandy. I forget her last name, but I know her as
Satsakorafi.
Sandy. Yeah, because she was part of that summer school when we were there. And she was excellent, and she's actually helped us with a few things at ISSR in the past, which is really great. But I'm wondering if you could talk about your view of the complexity principle in light of your work. Do you think it still has purchasing power in the historiographies of science and religion, or do you think that it's a little too broad? Like I'd like your discussion on like the methodology of history and the usage of complexity. Do you think it still has purchase on our field?
I am a great admirer of T.H. Brooks' work generally and complexity specifically. And I had the honor of, and the privilege of actually conducting an interview with him. And I remember, and he
Oh
actually
wow.
wrote the same thing. And this interview actually is online in the show YouTube
Okay.
channel. And he said orally what he more or less later wrote in the complexity book that came out, specifically devoted to this idea that uh, these prankster roll numbers sort of associated the thesis with me, and and now I'm stuck with it. And he said, I never intended to make the claim that historians should be careful. Of course, we should be careful. What I try to say is that we should be very, at least this is what I understood from what he said, because he's a very, very clever person. Um, we should be very careful on what elements and what themes we take for granted when we go into the sources, and we should
Mhm.
try identify the themes from within the sources rather than imposing them on top. Perhaps I am projecting here, and but I think in that sense of the complexity thesis, because if that book taught us everything, I mean the old book book on science and religion, some historiographical considerations, was that look, I'm presenting to you several cases which cannot fit under the same labels. So the labels should be discussed a bit more carefully. And I think that Peter Harrison's work, another giant in the field, also went in that same direction with the ideas of science and religion itself. In that specific sense, I think we have not taken this methodology seriously enough. I think we should
Okay.
go a step further and push on the narratives and the themes and the analytical categories even more. I think that we can do a lot of work in the concept of Europe from science and religion, in the concept of the West, on the concept of the East, on the concept of religion versus religiosity, not religion as theology, what you mentioned already, but religion as a lived experiment, which, as Peter Harrison has taught us, and as many historians of ancient religion knew already, it didn't have anything to do with what we believe today to be religion. It didn't have to do anything with a holy book. And there are lots of books that have come out on this, Gobry's religion, and so on and so forth. I think as a field we should move in that direction now. Be more complex in our complexity theory.
That's great. That's a nice little ending, but I do want to give you one last opportunity to reflect on what you would like future scholars entering the field, or even current scholars, to take away from your contribution to our field. What is the thing that you would like most to be taken away from it?
I would be enormously proud and happy if my work pushed some people to consider the interplay between science, religion, and nationalism, which was actually the title of a recent book I co-edited. I would be more than happy if people in my work could find elements that would help them redefine how they approach the concept of religion beside theology. And if they would consider global history to actually have a meso aspect rather than let's say, Europe and Asia focus, which is very important. It has taught us a lot, but I think we can move forward and bring Africa into the fold, and bring the Balkans into the fold, and bring all these borderline cases. Africa is not a borderline case, but I think you get my point. If people because they read something on Greece, they started thinking on how this could be applied to their own work, this concept of national identity, nationalism, how religion affects the everyday life of scientists, as scholars, as citizens, I would be enormously proud and happy.
Okay. Well,
Did I
Kostas,
answer the
thank you.
question?
You did. You absolutely did. I think that's probably the takeaway that would be really great for everyone to get on board with. I think that there's a lot of work to be done, especially in Africa. I know that the MENA region has been growing a little bit. The INSBS, which we were a part of, and that's where we last met. They did a small seed, not that small, but a smallish amount on the grand scheme of things for MENA, which I think produced a little bit, but there's a lot of work to be done there. I think you're right. But yeah, no, like I said at the beginning, when I was first introduced to these histories of this area, which we're calling the Balkans, including Greece, it was a whole different world, and I had no idea, and it was so different, so interesting and rich. And I really hope that more people can learn about this. So I'm gonna throw your book probably on the screen here, this edited collection that we've been talking about, so people can be aware of it. And I'll include a link below. But Kostas, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and share your work and your thoughts on this really important topic with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity, thank you for the honor, and thank you for the privilege of having this discussion.
Well,
It was very nice seeing you again, even via
yes,
small screens.
virtually, yes, of course. Well,
Virtually.
you take care, and we'll
You
talk
too.
very soon. Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.